sector automotriz. Con ello, posterior, después más o menos 2 meses, que se reactivó de manera rápida la industria. Afortunadamente, como esencial, se marcó el sector automotriz y con ello, de manera rápida y acelerada, empezamos nuevamente a reactivarnos, a reactivar la economía, nuestros procesos productivos y con ello el entorno pues se complicó en cuestiones de tener que atender la salud de nosotros, producto del COVID, y también el poder atender nuestra parte laboral. Esto sin duda también trajo esta manera abrupta de reaccionar el mercado, de alguna manera bueno en la cuestión económica, pero no tan bueno para nosotros en la cuestión de nuestras actividades, pues hizo que nos moviéramos de manera rápida y que nos pudiéramos adaptar a una nueva situación a nivel mundial. Con ello, pues nuevamente el estar acelerándonos, consiguiendo los materiales, consiguiendo los transportes, los artículos de primera necesidad, para que pudiéramos echar a andar las empresas, para que pudiéramos poder producir y suministrar los productos a lo largo de nuestra cadena de suministro para nuestros clientes finales o las armadoras. Esto sin duda pues, ha sido una situación que nunca nosotros en nuestras vidas habíamos nosotros vivido y que afortunadamente y de manera positiva, lo digo, pues nos hizo el poder reflexionar y el poder saber y entender que podemos hacer las cosas de mejor manera, aún y con estas adversidades. Con ello, pienso que este webinar, que es precisamente parte de ello, Resiliencia en tiempos de disrupción, será bastante interesante y nos hará reflexionar de todo lo anterior que he mencionado, todo lo positivo, todo lo que hemos vivido, la situación como nos hemos adaptado para poder subsistir y salir adelante. Y también, sin duda, será de mucho aprendizaje y que quizás con ello nos haga hacer las cosas de la misma manera o de mejor manera para poder subsistir y continuar saliendo adelante ante estas adversidades que se han presentado.
Muchísimas gracias, Mario, por tu introducción. Si me permiten, el webinar del día de hoy va a ser en inglés, por lo que, bueno, en estos momentos voy a cambiar de idioma y me permito introducir o presentarles a David y a Andrew. David Carson leads the U.S. manufacturing and automotive industry practice for Marsh, and it's based in Cleveland. He's responsible for building and growing the practice and ensuring consistent delivery of Marsh industry-leading products and solutions to address the seismic shifts that innovation and the mobility ecosystem are bringing to Marsh manufacturing and automotive clients on a global basis. Welcome, David. Also, Andrew, it's a vehicle expert at Oliver Wyman's office in Detroit. He advises light-duty and commercial vehicle manufacturers and suppliers in the areas of product development, effectiveness, technology, strategy, complexity management, product cost optimization, and warranty quality improvement programs. His main functional area of expertise includes R&D, product development, purchasing, and service relating to vehicle, electronics, and powertrain systems. Welcome, Andrew, and have a good luck in your presentation.
Thank you, Jose, and thank you, Mario. It's a pleasure to be here today with my colleague, Andrew Chin. We are going to start at a high level with some conversation around what we're seeing in the industry. As you can see from our title, Resiliency in Times of Disruption, but accelerating into the new normal. We thought that was an appropriate title. So again, my name is David Carlson, and I lead the industry practice for Marsh & McLennan, automotive, manufacturing, and let me get to the next slide. So when we look at the automotive industry, we were talking as panelists earlier about just how quickly things are changing on a daily basis and how it must be very challenging for automotive and manufacturing companies to stay abreast of these things. Obviously, COVID and the global pandemic really put a tremendous amount of pressure on the automotive industry. And what we've seen as a result is a push to build greater resiliency across the entire enterprise while trying to keep pace with competition and the speed for the race of what we call mobility supremacy. Because the automotive industry isn't just about building cars anymore. It's about sharing economy. It's about subscription services and autonomous vehicles, smart cities, so many more things than just building a vehicle now. Andrew will drill down deeper into one area, which is electrification. The second bullet is that the ecosystem is reshaping and once proverbial, what we call a rite of passage, where many people felt that once you became of age, driving was something that you just did and you wanted to do. It's a form of freedom. Everybody wanted to get out and drive a vehicle. Well, from now, car ownership is now rapidly evolving into something more highly connected, mobility as a service. And we were talking earlier about how many people don't get driver's licenses, or they don't want to own a car, that they'd rather have a service, and that, car ownership is a burden, or that they'd rather have a car that they could share and be more sustainable and more eco-friendly. And these are all really good, admirable things. But how the industry changes, how rapidly the industry changes, that's what many of you and many of our customers and clients are going through right now and will continue to go through. One of the big risks or areas of operational performance that we saw COVID exacerbate and impact greatly was the physical supply chains. And we are seeing that continually now with the semiconductor shortages, or the blockage of the Suez Canal, or wildfires in parts of the world, or snowstorms in Texas and Louisiana impacting foam and foam seating. The typhoon right now that's over near Japan and China, where we might see disruption of ports that are going on right now. So the ports are already backed up with ships, with cargo and vessels. And now we're going to have, our common, typhoons. The United States is going to start seeing hurricane season soon. I mean, it's kind of a never-ending story here. But what's happening is it's also making us look at the digital supply chain and building digital twins and modeling of supply chains, where many organizations are saying, should we reshore? Should we bring production back closer to home? Should we actually go against lean manufacturing and actually build buffers and not have just-in-time inventory? So there's a lot of questions that are coming out between the physical and the digital supply chain. And when you do that, the digital supply chain is interesting because manufacturing operations are becoming more ubiquitous with technology. And to build the automotive car of the future, you have to have an automotive factory of the future. And so we're continually seeing this advent of technology being built in. And so supply chains are no different, and that they have to change. And when we have circular economies, now we're seeing circular supply chains as well, and trying to create more integration and control over the supply chains. We are seeing a great acceleration, obviously, of the development, including connected, autonomous, shared and electrified, or CASE is what the acronym, or ACES, ACES is what we also see people call it. This technology and mobility and is as a service, as I said earlier. So it's no longer just trying to build the latest model, the fastest car, or the biggest SUV, or the biggest truck. It's about what can that product do? Can it be connected? Can it become an autonomous vehicle? Can it be a shared vehicle? Can it be used in a fleet of vehicles with like an Uber or a Lyft or a Waymo, or could it be used for something else that isn't your typical service? So that's one of the things we're seeing. And so that's why the ACES, or the CASE acronym, is so important. And again, Andrew's going to talk about the electrification part alone. The second to the last bullet is this vaccination rates in the US and other parts of the world as infections still fluctuate. And many of you have heard these variants are now causing issues across the world. They will ultimately disrupt workforce. And the workforce is critical to the manufacturing and automotive industry. And much of what we've been able to do through COVID, we've been able to work at home or we've been able to work remotely. But at the end of the day, we still need people in the factories. We still need people on the shop floor building equipment, building products. And so we'll have to see how these major health and safety concerns and these priorities in the post-pandemic and what many have termed as the new pandemic of the unvaccinated. And so now we're seeing that go on right now globally, and it is a phenomenon we have to deal with. And then finally, we can never lose sight of some of the core tenets, vehicle safety. As we go towards connected, autonomous, shared, electrified, the hallmark of the automotive equipment manufacturers, or the OEMs and the suppliers, is vehicle safety. And how autonomy is going to, ultimately, these cars will be much safer, according to what we believe. But during that transition period, during the period where we'll have autonomous and connected vehicles along with traditional cars, we have to be aware that a new risk comes out, cybersecurity. And what does that mean with the highly connected cars and systems, and not only just the vehicles, but the factories? So as the old saying goes, with every great new technological advancement, there does come risk, but with the risk comes reward. And so these are the things that we've been watching and paying close attention to. My next slide is really kind of an overview of what I talked about when we talked about CASE. When you looked at connected vehicles, these new profit pools or profit centers or digital services are becoming part of a car. The car is almost like a rolling iPhone, if you will. And these ecosystem owners, meaning these companies that are starting subscription services or sharing services, this is a new way to monetize revenue. And if you look at Ford or GM or Tesla or any OEM in the world, BMW, doesn't matter who it is, they're all building subscription services and different services for renewable revenue, even insurance products now. So that's the connected piece. Autonomous, obviously, level 5 autonomy is where they want to go, but that means there's no steering wheel, there's no gas pedal. This is literally a vehicle that comes and gets you and takes you somewhere where you will have no driving capability. But until then, we'll have advanced driver assist systems or ADAS and high levels up into level 3, level 4 autonomy. And then autopilot solutions and providers, again, most of that comes back to safety and trying to build a safer vehicle, where an autonomous vehicle can't be distracted. It can't be under the influence. It's not going to veer at something. It's going to understand its environment. But we have a long road ahead of us on that. And shared mobility, I talked quite a bit about that, where we see the industry going, that large urban areas are starting to see, robo-taxis and more shared economy and less people. I mean, think about it. I know in some of the major metropolitan areas in the United States, a parking space in an apartment building in a large metropolitan area will cost you $40,000 or $50,000 US just to have a parking spot for your vehicle. Imagine somebody coming out of college with college debt, and it's hard enough to get an apartment in a major metropolitan area, but now to have to pay that kind of money for a vehicle to park a car, it's easier just to hail a robo-taxi or hail an Uber or a Lyft or share a vehicle. Infrastructure. Charging, the way of the future of electrification. Andrew's going to talk about this, but the infrastructure changes that have to happen. And I know Andrew's going to talk about in the United States, we just had a recent legislation pass. I'll let him talk about that. But the adoption of that and the adoption of these services, the Internet of Things, and utilizing the vehicle, like I said, in a very different way. It's not from point A to point B anymore. It's all that you can do in between, while trying to remain safe and not be distracted, obviously, within the car. Finally, e-mobility. We talk about this. The government and different policies that our governments are looking at, not only in the United States, but globally, to sustain and ultimately, replace what we consider internal combustion engines. It gets down to what we call environmental, societal, and governance, or ES&G, and climate and sustainability, which are really important factors for large automotive equipment manufacturers, the OEMs, and their suppliers, to have a sustainable future for our children and our children's children. And then also the construction and infrastructure. Again, infrastructure is going to be key to support smart technology, smart cars, electrification, alternative sources, not just electrification, but hydrogen and other forms of energy too. I have one more slide. And this slide, I think, is really interesting. If you think about 25 years ago, this slide would look very different. I think the road would almost be kind of straight. But now when you look at this road, it's very windy and it's also changing. Everything from rideshare to last mile delivery, micro mobility like scooters, smart cities globally. I just have a few up there, just examples within the United States. Car share and subscription programs, digital payments, where your car can actually pay. You can use it to pay for gas or groceries and other things that are going down. New companies that are building the autonomous vehicle technology, the hardware, then the software companies that are also building this technology. So where we might see companies who build internal combustion carburetors and other things that go into internal combustion engines, as we start to see those companies pivot and hopefully try and stay within the industry, we see all these new companies who are building technology that's more software related and different hardware like computer systems and CPUs. That gets us into the digitally native companies like the Fiskars and the Lucids that are driving a lot of this, along with the Fords and the GMs, who are also building their innovation groups and building out their own technology centers to compete with these new startup companies. Autonomous trucking, probably the place where we will see the greatest advent and use of and commercialization of autonomy before commercialized passenger cars will be in the trucking industry. Operators of autonomy. So again, using autonomous vehicles in the way of shared economy space, not just selling a car to myself or you as individuals, but maybe selling cars in large fleets that can go around like robo-taxis. And then finally, we are literally working with and talking to companies that are building electric vertical takeoff and landing devices, drones, jetpacks, just you name it. We're seeing so many unique things. So the world of what I would call mobility is really advanced and changed so much. And so hopefully that gives everybody an understanding of where we see much of the industry going and the risks associated with it. But I wanted to kind of set the table for Andrew, who's going to really have a more narrow scope conversation around electrification and where we see that, because we all know every single day we hear about charging, lithium ion, new models of vehicles, and what that's going to mean for the industry as everybody is racing towards electrification. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to my colleague, Andrew.
Very good. Thank you, David. And outstanding introduction in terms of outlining all the major issues. When we talked about preparing for this presentation, it could have easily have been a 5 or 6 hour long discussion where we would have skimmed the surface, but rather sort of something very topical that I think is probably on everyone's mind. And certainly coming out of the pandemic and with the last year or two, it's probably accelerated the introduction of vehicle electrification. So maybe just a few sort of introductory remarks then before I run into the heart of the presentation. I think as we start to sort of look at the future, what's quite interesting about this sort of standard slide that I use is that compared to the past, it's still hard to predict the future, but you don't have to wait 10 or 15 or 20 years to find out whether or not you're right or you made a mistake. Nowadays, with the rate of change and with the rate of disruption, probably it's a week or two, and then you have to revise either your presentation, your point of view, or your article. But I think we're at the point where, especially as we get into battery electric vehicles, the question is, and I'll spend the next few pages laying out why our point of view is that it's not whether electrification will occur, but if and when it will occur. So on the next page, you'll see some cost breakdowns with regards to battery electrification on battery pack costs. And at the end of the day, the opportunity and what will drive widespread adoption of electrified vehicles is fundamentally going to be one regarding battery pack costs. And many good things happen when these costs come down. Range anxiety becomes much less of an issue. As you'll see, costs potentially also come down, and this becomes a real source of opportunity where we see OEMs and the suppliers beginning to embrace this concept of electrification as being actually not just market development that they have to react to, but rather something that's actually quite powerful in the longer term as a disruptive cost improvement technology. So as you can sort of see, that the big question I think everyone's had with regards to battery costs would be the projected improvement over time in terms of cost reduction. Historically, pack costs have been dropping at anywhere from 3 to 5 to 10 or 20% year over year based on scale and where we are in the curve. And of course, the question in terms of trying to predict the future is, are we at the point where the curve is flattened out, or are we going to see continued reductions in terms of dollars per kilowatt hour? I would sort of maybe throw out to this group that when we view where battery development is compared to sort of more mature technologies, the internal combustion engine, diesel, auto, sort of more or less developed in 1876. So it's been almost 145 years now of continual improvement, refinement. If you sort of take the battery roadmap and put it on that same timeline, what I'd sort of leave you at is that we're basically sitting around 1916 in terms of where battery maturity sits. So I think it's very plausible to sort of argue that we have quite a bit of room in front of us in terms of learning curve effects, economies of scale, improvements that will continue to take pack costs down significantly. And as you'll see on the next page, when we take battery costs down, and this is sort of a magic number of, call it $50 to $70 or euros per kilowatt hour, it actually allows products to that are electrified to sort of look and feel a bit like internal combustion powered vehicles, i.e., not having to worry about having to recharge your vehicle every other day or every day, but rather having something in the neighborhood of 450, 500 kilometers of range, 300 miles between sort of stops, if you will, really begins to normalize the usage patterns regarding battery electrified vehicles. Going on to the next page, I guess that then touches on the question of when does the adoption actually occur? Our view on this is that it's not necessarily a winner take all game, much like when you had diesels and gasoline powered vehicles. Electrification is a propulsion technology that's quite suited for some applications, not nearly as well suited for other applications. And sooner or later, once the market demand from a consumer standpoint really begins to pick up and the sort of market incentives imposed by governments begin to slow down, the real question is this 5 or 10 or 15 or 20% type of technology, or is it more like a 30 or 40% technology? So this is probably, again, getting to that question of when rather than if. So there's a range of sort of possible outcomes that we've modeled. If you go to the next page, coming out of COVID, probably all the headlines. In fact, David and I were just speaking before we started about how literally every day something new happens in the marketplace with regards to electrification. So what was maybe one of the more recent headlines from 3 or 4 days ago is this push by the Biden administration in the United States to raise fuel efficiency standards to effectively, sort of Trump to almost increasingly above Obama level regulations, and with the goal of trying to get EV sales as a percentage of total vehicle sales to 40 or 50% of sales by 2030. And interestingly enough, you sort of think about that 40 to 50%, that number represents anywhere from 8 to 10 million vehicles being electrified. Even if that number, it's a target, not actually a regulation or a mandate. So even if it's 10 or 20%, you're still talking about, you know, 1 million plus 2 million, 3 million units just in the you know, sort of USMCA market. What's been very interesting coming out of just the last day or two, and just a few hours ago, in fact, so the U.S. Senate just passed the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and within that $1 trillion package, which is admittedly a very big number, there's a smaller number that is probably only small to the government, but enormous for the rest of us, in that there is a $7.5 billion funding provision for charging stations. And this will really represent the first time that, at least in the United States, that the government has, you know, started to put real money against creating the infrastructure to support EVs. And of course, the question has always been, you know, is it chicken and egg? Do you need to have a charging infrastructure before you have widespread adoption, or do you need widespread adoption of vehicles before the charging infrastructure comes? It looks like the two are sort of matching together in pretty good locksync. The other, I think, COVID, and this will be sort of the last slide recapping trends, and we'll talk about implications after this, is that coming out of COVID, what we're seeing is, in all things, consumer products, an enormous spike in demand. Our modeling suggests that just to get vehicle inventories back to where they were in 2019, there's an additional 2.5 million units of production needed to get you know, what dealers have in their yards right now, from the sort of 10, 14-day level that they're at, more back to their traditional inventory levels. So there's not just the, call it 17, 18 million units of vehicle production that that's forecast for 2021, but also on top of that, another 2+ million of vehicles required just to put inventory back into fleets. So sort of the backdrop on all this is, you know, quite exciting. The pressure is actually there in terms of how quickly can the OEMs and the associate suppliers, you know, pivot to the new normal, if you will. So now with the next page, we're going to sort of talk about some of the implications. And I think, you know, broadly speaking, change is good for some, not so good for others. The question is, you know, how to respond to it, and given sort of the time frame that we have, you know, be able to actually monetize that. So sort of three of the sort of major macro changes, if you will, and it's kind of interesting to sort of think about, you know, each of these in a bit more detail. Is one, what does this mean in terms of the overall powertrain sector impact? So traditionally, powertrain has been the single largest subsystem within a vehicle. It's well over a third of the total material cost of a standard vehicle, and that cost has been going up in the last few years as fuel economy requirements have been increasing and emissions requirements have been tightening, and tailpipe has been decreasing. So very big change on the powertrain sector as a whole. Number two is, as you look at the charts I'd shown earlier about battery electric costs falling, you know, I think it's quite plausible to believe that at some point in time, with increasing emissions requirements and other things in terms of fossil fuel powered vehicles, that it will actually be cheaper to actually produce a battery electric vehicle rather than a conventional internal combustion powered vehicle. So that sort of suggests all sorts of interesting possibilities, because there's certainly not much indication that this is going to result in consumer pricing coming down. Maybe the rate of growth might plateau a little bit, but there's, you know, very little indication that the OEMs are going to step backwards and sort of begin to reduce vehicle prices, but rather, and then going on to this third implication, is this idea of how do I actually add content, do other things to make their products more interesting, more appealing to a vehicle, when powertrain, which was historically a huge differentiator, people talk about 0 to 60 times, how much horsepower their vehicles had. This is going to become somewhat irrelevant in the next vehicle cycle or two as we move more and more into electrified vehicles. So very good. What we do first is maybe just briefly touch on the next page, the macro shifts at a country region level. And sort of you have sort of two groups, I guess, if you look at this from a broad geopolitical standpoint. You have economies, automotive economies that are sort of very, very heavily tied to either traditional or advanced powertrain concepts. So on one end of the spectrum, you have Germany. On the other hand of the spectrum, you have China. With Germany, there's quite a bit of discussion around what does this mean in terms of the machining and tooling and production sector, where, as you can imagine, the economy is very, very, very heavily biased towards diesel and gasoline-powered vehicles. What happens to this entire infrastructure that was built up over the last 100, 150 years? As you can imagine, the names Otto and diesel are not sort of, American, Canadian, or Mexican, or Japanese names. They're your German names. The interesting thing, and then we'll see in a little more detail in the next few pages, is this idea that in North America, there will be an impact, but we view that the impact will be a bit more moderate, than in Germany. And then you see China, of course, where they are actually tooling up for very large scale electrification. So if you run to the next page, we did some very simple modeling that every point of increased vehicle share, so i.e., 1% of vehicle sales go from conventional powertrains to electrified vehicles, that's equal to about 185,000 fewer engines and conventional transmissions. So at a 15 or 25% EV share, which is substantially below the targets that the Biden administration just set out earlier in the week. Nonetheless, this indicates that this is something in the neighborhood of an 18,000 to 29,000 full-time equivalent displacement at the OEM powertrain plant level. And I think, as many of the suppliers, tier 1, tier 2s, tier 3s know that there's quite a bit of trickle down impact with regards to what does this mean for a valve train supplier or a spring supplier or a piston supplier. So this is one of sort of the shifts, and there's been quite a bit of discussion, especially with within the OEMs and the organized labor groups representing them, what to do as share begins to shift and you begin to see powertrain plants beginning to consolidate and shut down. Going on to the next page, there's also going to be ultimately reduced content at the assembly plant. I mean, putting together a battery electric vehicle is actually much simpler than assembling a powertrain, a conventionally powered vehicle. Now, interesting enough, this sort of data, which comes from our Harbor report, which is a benchmarking study that we do that involves all the major OEMs around the world and their productivity, is you can sort of see that the results are kind of mixed at this point. I think with BEVs and electrified vehicles, there's still a small enough share that you're seeing oddities where in the body shop portion of an assembly plant, it actually takes more hours to produce an electrified vehicle. At the paint shop, the electrified vehicles are roughly require a little bit less time. And then within assembly, you see electrified vehicles taking more time. I think this is sort of symptomatic of the fact that some of the high costs associated with electrified vehicles currently are tied to the fact that we're still at the lower end of the curve in terms of economies of scale, learning curve, in terms of getting proficient at producing a relatively new type of vehicle versus the same type of vehicle that the industry's been producing for the last 150 years. So ultimately, we also tend to believe that we will see some displacement in terms of activity at the assembly plant level also, given that BEVs are easier to actually produce than their IC powered counterparts. Next page. We talk a little bit about what does it mean in terms of employment and activity. The sort of takeaway and the concept that OEMs and some suppliers are beginning to embrace in the next vehicle cycle or two is that electrification isn't just sort of a disruptive technology from how you engineer a vehicle, how you produce it, some of the underlying technologies, but fundamentally, it is a disruptive technology that has ultimately a cost footprint that's significantly below conventional IC powered engines. So if you sort of step back and think about that right now, without maybe looking at the cost data that I showed earlier, if you think about a conventional engine, you have 2,000 or 3,000 components within it, an enormous amount of highly precise machining, finishing, operations associated with it. It's a technology that's required 150 years to sort of perfect. Whereas if you think about the operations in a battery pack factory, much more simpler. It's primarily chemistry related. It's forming packs, sealing them, testing electrical conductivity and circuits. But you don't have multi-million-dollar tooling centers that are boning, honing, polishing, etc. It is much more of an assembly type of operation. So there's quite a bit of belief that ultimately, and we're just starting to see the research now, that battery packed in BEVs will ultimately, on a like-for-like basis, be less expensive than their IC powered equivalent. If you sort of go to the next page, we mentioned that IC, the current powertrain, is about a third-ish of the cost of the vehicle. As we shift to battery electric vehicles, that section in the blue will actually shrink a little bit due to the fact that BEVs are going to be less expensive, and also just due to the fact that content will sort of disappear. You're not going to need a 9-speed transmission, for instance, with a battery electric vehicle. So what this really begins to sort of set the stage for, and I'll sort of maybe wrap on my very last page, which is the next one, is it really does this idea that, again, battery vehicle prices are unlikely to fall in the future. As we know, these in the automotive game, margins are extremely tight. We're talking about high single digits, maybe double digit on a net income basis. So we don't necessarily anticipate price points falling, but given the fact that battery electric vehicles present sort of a cost reduction opportunity, and then two, it presents a major sort of transition point in terms of product differentiation. So using an example on the first column, in the 1940s, 1950s, having an automatic transmission, huge differentiator. You don't have to shift yourself. The car does it. Maybe this is almost, if you will, autonomous 0.1, a very baby step towards having vehicle functions being taken on by a vehicle versus the driver having to do everything. And the attributes of hands-free shifting, easy to use, and the popularity of it was really driven home by the fact that you have 80+% differentiation. David talked about alluded to the fact that with driving and people of licenses and large urban centers, you can imagine if there's a question about mobility and the next generation, Gen Z, having licenses, you can probably win quite a bit of money by betting on how many people can drive a manual transmission vehicle. So yesterday, automatic transmissions, as we now all know, this is automatic transmission. No one really advertises how many speeds they have in an automatic transmission, but rather this is just a convenience feature, which at the end of the day, when you look at quality and warranty reports, you never typically see transmissions being called out as a thing gone right or as a positive attribute. At best, it's something that's ignored. People comment on the refinement of the drivetrain, how smooth the power delivery is, but you don't ever hear anyone calling out, this is a great transmission. Rather, what you see, unfortunately, is it's a thing gone wrong. The shifts are harsh. The shifts don't happen on time, etc. So if you pivot to maybe the last 50 years, differentiation has very much been on engines. How much horsepower? How quickly can the vehicle accelerate? How smoothly does the engine perform? What battery electrified vehicles sort of present this interesting conundrum to the OEMs is this no longer becomes a very relevant point of differentiation, in that the lowest acceleration time vehicles, i.e., best 0 to 60 performance, they're no longer IC engine vehicles. They're electrified vehicles. It's frankly a bit like comparing the acceleration of a motorcycle to a car. The motorcycle is always going to win. The BEV now, when properly optimized and designed, you have acceleration times in the 4 seconds, 5 seconds, fast enough that no one's, it's going to be very hard to differentiate on that. And interestingly, you don't see much in the press about electrified vehicles being, they talk about how wonderful the performance is, but you never see 0 to 60 times being quoted anymore. And sort of interesting enough, engines are also becoming a bit like a transmission in terms of it no longer just being a positive attribute, but more of maybe a thing gone wrong. With the increasing complexity of emissions, there's studies indicating that and I think probably most of us fall under this category, 15% of all vehicles that are active right now have their yellow engine malfunction light going on in their dash, which is different from the red light, which means stop, there's something really wrong with your engine, and rather the yellow light is an indication that there potentially is some issue with the emission system. So sort of wrapping us up on the very last column is, how do we differentiate tomorrow? If powertrains are no longer going to be a point of differentiation, and you have, call it a $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 sort of material cost benefit that the OEMs will probably take maybe half, a third of that, there's still $1,000, $2,000, let's say, of content that can be put into vehicles to make fundamentally the product more appealing. So there's sort of a view that in the future, vehicles are going to be much more like full-size trucks or even minivans, in that it's the creature comforts, the convenience factor elements within the vehicle, having a third row seat that folds and disappears for utility. These are going to be the items, a step gate in the tailgate of your truck. These are going to be sort of the items that will continue to differentiate in what OEMs and suppliers will try to compete on, versus the last 100, 150 years where they were competing on how big is your engine, how many cylinders does it have, how fast does your car accelerate. All right, done with my presentation. Back to the presenter group.
Thank you very much, David, Andrew. Now we're going to move on with the Q&A section. We have some questions. Just 1 second. Okay, so I will start. what do you recommend for the automotive sector in Mexico in order to be prepared for this disrupting time due to global supply chain issues, new technologies, etc.? I don't know who wants to answer this. Andrew, David.
Yeah, maybe I can maybe quickly and this is sort of I think indicative of how the sector, how the Mexican automotive sector has developed over the last 20, 30 years. So, in its early genesis and maybe through even NAFTA period, it was, very much on cost, right? Where a near-shore alternative to low-cost countries, come to us because of the fact that, it's fundamentally, it's almost as inexpensive to produce in Mexico, say, in the maquila or sort of, in the automotive clusters that have arisen versus having to go overseas. And you actually see quite a bit of that with the growth in assembly plants in Mexico from, the Europeans, the Japanese, and the US OEMs. Increasingly so, what we see in these times is that, intellectual capital, the ability to sort of develop and innovate, and also, and this is probably a broader topic that's infrastructure related, is very reliable, predictable logistics to continue to serve assembly plants, within the different, within the USMCA on a JIT basis. And in fact, from a logistics standpoint, you see there's enormous bidding activity for Kansas City Southern. I think the latest bid is north of $30 billion. You have two railroads competing over that, and that's specifically just in order to sort of win the routes, the north-south routes going from the U.S. to Mexico and Mexico to the U.S. for vehicle traffic.
Perfect, Andrew. Thank you very much. Next one, it's for David. What do you consider to be the main skills that a buyer of the automotive industry has to develop in the following years?
Well, I think it's if you look at, and if they mean by a buyer, are they talking about OEMs or they're actually talking about consumers?
Tier 1 buyer.
Tier 1,
yeah.
Okay. I think it's really the partnership that you can bring and the value that you can bring to the OEM, because as Andrew talked about, so much of the world is going to change as far as the type of components and the technology that goes into the cars, that it's not just about anymore horsepower and fuel efficiency. That'll be a thing of the past. It'll be about infotainment systems. It'll be about the consumer experience. It'll be about the technology within the vehicle, all the way up to even things like insurance products and other electronic ways of doing business that people expect to come. So I think that those buyers, that those tier ones really need to look at, joint ventures, collaborations, and recognize that they can't do it alone. Technology is advancing so quickly that you can't go it alone anymore. You see all the partnerships and the joint ventures and the new companies that are starting up, literally venture capital and other things that are coming along that are creating new businesses and new ecosystems. So I think it's a willingness to purposefully change your business and be willing to expand and take on some risk. The opportunity is huge. I know I've seen some studies by Oliver Wyman. The opportunity out there for the new, quote, ecosystem is enormous. So there's tremendous opportunity out there. You just got to be willing to enter that and make it happen.
Of course. Thank you, David. Last question that we have until now. Could you mention 3 characteristics that the OEMs will look at? Will look at in following years. What they are going to change, what they are going to expect in the following years regarding OEMs.
Well, I'll take one. One is, we talked about this, is the concept of like mobility, about subscription services and insurance products and doing things very different for renewable revenue. vehicles might start to last longer. Again, they may be, the margins, as Andrew talked about, the marginalization of the vehicle and componentry. When you start looking at where they're going to offset different revenue, they've stopped different models, right? They can't continue to make certain ICE engine vehicles, so they're not selling as many models. They start to look at things like rideshare, subscription, insurance products. But these are also things that generate revenue year over year. So if you sell 3 to 4 million vehicles in the United States, and now you're selling 3 to 4 million auto insurance policies and 3 to 4 million subscription services, this becomes renewable revenue. So I think that's obviously, and that's not a crystal ball. You can see it, you can read it. It's happening right now. It's who's actually going to be an early adopter from the OEMs and who's going to wait and see. And there's some big disparity between certain OEMs who don't even talk about subscription or autonomy really, and others who have autonomous, driven millions of miles already, who offer insurance products, who offer subscription services. There's some very big differences right now. And some of it's cultural too. Some different cultures around the world are very different. So I think that would be one big differentiator that you're seeing in the OEMs. Andrew, what else do you think?
Yeah, maybe I know we're almost at time. So very quickly, for two other sort of observations, and this whole, we're bringing it back and maybe closing it on this idea of resiliency, is with the volatility and disruption that we're seeing over the last few years, is I think operationally, we're going to see inventories in general begin to rise again, where you can almost set your calendar to the fact that every couple of years, every 10 years, certainly there's going to be some massive supply chain disruption event. It could be a tsunami, it could be a recession, it could be a pandemic, but almost every 10 years, something like 5-10 years, something like this happens. And then the second thing is that to some degree, this harkens back to like the maybe early 1900s, and that as these technologies begin to emerge, OEMs are starting to put money against it. They're beginning to vertically integrate. You see that with certainly the battery technologies, and that it's almost like going back to Henry Ford and the Ford Rouge plant, and that you have a steel making operation, you have a glass making operation, you have a tire making operation. In this case, in the 21st century, tires, glass, and steel might be batteries, autonomous software, or infotainment systems.
Perfect. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, David. Next and last question now. It's how you see raw material availability regarding higher content of electronics, battery manufacturing, talking about rare earth metals needed. Is the industry mining for this steep increase of BEV? Really prepare or will supply situation for that kind of industry get even worse? What do you think? Long question.
I'll kick it to Andrew, but I will say this. I do believe that this goes far beyond just the rare metals, and which I think will happen. And we saw that with the Dodd-Frank Act, and we saw that with some issues that went on there. But you get into political unrest, and you get into a lot of other things where a lot of these rare metals, these materials are going to be coming from. And sustainability, I talked about it earlier. Environmental, societal, and governance, climate and sustainability are very key tenets to the long-term success of organizations, along with diversity and inclusion of the workforce and skill sets. I think heavy regulatory scrutiny might be on the path for many of these that we don't see yet, but we know it's going to come down the path. I know, Andrew, I know OW's got a kind of a view there too, and you probably want to add something as well.
Yeah, I would just say that certainly in the near term, that there is going to be disruption, and this whole concept of geopolitical risk that David mentioned, it's quite apparent. But I would sort of suggest as sort of a good comparator is that we are creating a completely new supply chain that's different than what the industry has spent the last 150 years on. So much in the same way that, when gasoline was adopted, on a pretty widespread basis, you certainly have regions and countries with very little fossil fuels that are usable. In the same way that in the 1900s, et cetera, there's a big fight for nickel and chromium and other strategic, if you will, materials that you need to make steel. in the same way that, you know, these sort of disruptions, and I think the supply chain will ultimately, you know, work itself out. But in the mean, you know, it's going to, you know, strap yourself in. It's probably going to be a fairly bumpy and turbulent ride, which is even more reason why we believe we're going to see inventory levels in general rise as buffering mechanisms.
Yeah, Andrew, I think a good analogy on that would be like what's going on with the semiconductors right now. We're seeing how fragile supply chains are when, you know, 12-13% of all semiconductors are consumed by Apple, and then the entire automotive industry is what, 8-10%, Andrew, something around that. So you've got, you know, again, that's like a precious metal almost. It's something that you know, people can't get a hold of. Well, let's look at the batteries and everything else and different materials. I think that's what we're going to have seen too. Is that just, you know, the old adage: a butterfly flaps its wings in Africa, and a hurricane shows up over in the Caribbean. I think we're going to see that with some of these materials, and we have to be prepared. And Andrew, I think you said it very well. I think we're going to see buffers. We're going to see companies having to do that to be able to meet demand for the future.
Flexibility and risk management will be everything. David, Andy, thank you very much for your participation, and we're really excited that you were here. We really appreciate the information that you shared with us, and we want to give you a digital recognition. So it says, I will read it. Guanajuato's Automotive Cluster recognizes David Carlson for his valuable, David and Andrew Chin, for his valuable participation in the webinar Resiliency in Times for Disruption, Accelerating into the New Normal, held on August 10, 2021. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a great session.
Thank you very much. Pues muchas gracias a los que todavía siguen con nosotros. El día de hoy también venimos a hacerles una invitación. Este webinar fue parte de una preparación de una serie de webinars que estamos haciendo para ustedes, que son parte de un congreso, del cual Ana Luisa Elizondo, quien es vicepresidente del Comité de Compras, pues nos platicará un poquito. Adelante, Anita.
Muchas gracias, José. La verdad es que el clúster, junto con un grupo de colaboradores del gobierno del estado, ha preparado y ha puesto mucho empeño en desarrollar este primer congreso. Son 19 ponencias que van a estar sumamente interesantes.